this is awesome. This feedback is terrible. Okay. So, hi. Thank you for having me speak. It's quite an honor. If Dr. Prasad asks for something, I typically say yes. Thank you, Erica, for that introduction. It's great. I wrote it myself. See, you guys laugh. I think I'm joking, but I actually wrote it. I want to talk a little bit about how I got involved with this. So I am an addiction medicine doctor. I also practice full spectrum family medicine. And race has actually always been, I wouldn't say an issue in my life, but it's always been something I've been aware of. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And I grew up in a really interesting neighborhood. Use the term interesting. It was this very upper middle class / upper class enclave in this old area of Brooklyn that was surrounded by Flatbush. And for those of you that don't know, Flatbush is not exactly the best neighborhood in the world. And Flatbush is quite racially diverse, mostly lower socioeconomic class, though not always. And so that's the neighborhood I grew up in. So it was just like a 3-block area that was nice. Not nice, I mean wealthy. And then Flatbush surrounded it. And so when I was growing up, most of my friends were from Flatbush, and most of my classmates were from Flatbush. I went to the public school system in New York until 4th grade. When I went to this school called St. Anne's, which is not a Catholic school, as you can imagine, someone with the last name of Levy probably doesn't go to Catholic school. But it was this weird kind of socialist, for lack of a better term, school that attracted these very odd people from all parts of Brooklyn. As you can imagine, Brooklyn's only gotten hotter, but and so there were actually fairly a mix of a lot of racially diverse people, all of them wealthier because it was a private school. And my best friend at the time was a guy named Greg. And Greg's parents, his dad was from Jamaica, his mom was from the Philippines. They met in Brooklyn. And his dad was a microbiologist and mom was a pediatrician. And so Greg naturally went to law. He was like, I want to do either of those things. So Greg looked African American. I mean, he really couldn't pass for anything other than that. And a lot of my childhood, which was in the 80s and 90s, it would always strike me that Greg had very different views of things than I did. And I didn't understand. It took me a long time to understand why. And I have to admit, I still don't understand it nearly as well as Greg did, who had to live it. But I started to get interested in that, and that kind of how I am able to perceive things differently than other people, how other people are able to perceive things differently than me based on my race, has been something that I've been interested in my whole life, ever since I was a little kid, basically. And I mean, the 80s and 90s, there were interesting things going on in New York. If you guys remember, I don't know if you remember, but there were race riots in LA after the O.J. Simpson, well, no, it was after Rodney King, and then they were very concerned about that after O.J., but it didn't actually happen. And New York had David Dinkins as the mayor, and say what you want about David Dinkins. He did a great job with race relations in New York, and it was being talked about a lot. And New York City actually did not riot. It was one of the big cities that did not riot during that time. So it was just very interesting to talk to Greg throughout all that period of time and just get his perspective on things. And he still is actually one of my best friends. But he lives out in Washington now. He doesn't live in Brooklyn anymore. And so that's where I got started on this. So then I had my career. I got involved in addiction. And of course, you can't really get involved in addiction without talking about the war on drugs. Because I would say 25% of my patients, maybe more, come to see me because they're legally forced to. And the way they're legally forced to come see me for treatment, to be wherever I'm working. I used to work at the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation and split my time between the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation and Broadway. Now I work exclusively at Broadway North Memorial. They would be compelled to see me. There's actually a saying in addiction medicine, it's like the 4 L's, and I won't be able to remember it. It's like the law, the liver, the lover, and I can't remember, legal. No, that's law. I don't remember the 4th one. There's like 4 L's why people come for treatment. And legal is the big one. So it was kind of in my face. And then, practicing in North Minneapolis, you were confronted by the differences in the patient's experience. So at Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation, my predominant clientele was Caucasian. And at Broadway, my predominant clientele is African American. And the difference that the way that the law compels them to come see me is striking. And so I started to do some more research on that. And then also I got involved in racial justice and things like that a little bit. I'm not saying I'm big into this, but I just started doing some research on it, figuring out why we had all these felons, for lack of better terminology, at Broadway that were coming. And so I just want to read a quote that was from the Drug Policy Consortium. It's a group of people that study policy, particularly around the drug war. And their quote is, with less than 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of its incarcerated population, the United States imprisons more people than any other nation in the world. And it is largely due to the war on drugs. Misguided drug laws, this is their word, and harsh sentencing requirements have produced profoundly unequal outcomes for people of color, although rates of drug use and sales are similar across racial and ethnic lines. Black and Latino people are far more likely to be criminalized than white people. And those stats are from SAMHSA, which is the Society of Addiction Medicine and Mental Health. And these are all true stats. So to kind of go into a little bit about why that is, I just want to take us through a little bit of a journey of the history of illicit drugs in the United States. And it's interesting. One of the things I like to talk about when I teach addiction medicine to the residents is a little bit of the history of addicted substances throughout history, especially opioids. And now opioids were constantly marketed as non-addicting and then turned out to be addicting. And there are certain trends like that also for illicit drug use in the United States. So I don't know if you guys know this or not, but in the United States, and actually worldwide it mostly works out, that there's this cycle of drug use. And that there's a drug of choice that's very popular and then it kind of fades and another drug of choice takes over, and it's almost always an upper and then a downer, an upper and then a downer. So we can play this game now, right? What is the big drug of choice that people are abusing that everyone's talking about now? Opioids, right? What was it before opioids? Anyone remember?
Meth.
Meth. What was it before meth? It was heroin again. And before heroin is crack. Before crack it was ludes. But I mean, there's a pattern, right? So that's typically how it works. Well, in the United States, the first drug of abuse that really became popular, as anyone would guess? Alcohol. Tricky, right? People don't think of alcohol as a drug, but if you ever attend an NA meeting, it starts with the preamble. It says alcohol is a drug. And it is. It's treated as such. So alcoholism started, the definition of alcoholism actually came about in the late 1800s. Was when it first came out. It was originally thought of to be a moral issue. People lacked moral fiber. However, they started noticing that people that were previously considered upstanding members of society started having problems with alcohol use. And they didn't legalize it, but they started to study it and try to find a cure for it. And the first cure that was ever tried for alcoholism actually worked really, really well. It had incredibly high rates of success. People would stop drinking. It was morphine. You gave people morphine, they stopped drinking. The problem arose when you tried to have them stop taking morphine. It didn't work very well. The reason why these drugs are addicting, almost all drugs are addicting, don't worry, I'm not going to go into all the neurobiology of it, even though I know it, is because they basically have an effect instantaneously. And they make you feel good basically right away. And this is not lost on people in the United States before there was, shall we say, adequate oversight of drugs. There were all these snake oil salesmen. And one of the first elixirs and tonics that were marketed was a drug by Bayer, which is originally marketed as, of course, non-addicting morphine, and that was heroin. It was marketed for elixirs for children that were colicky, or for mothers that were stressed, or for toothaches, or for insomnia, or all sorts of things. And it exploded. The use of that exploded. They were very popular. You could sell a lot of this, as you can imagine. And people made a lot of money on this. And so this led to regulation. Also, at the same time, there was the rise of the hypodermic needle, especially in the late 1800s after the Civil War, and that led to more of problems with opioid use and dependence. So how does this affect what's going on in the United States? Well, the laws that the United States passed actually mirror, regarding the war on drugs, actually mirror the immigration waves from the United States. So prior to the 1880s, the predominant immigrants to the United States were Western Europeans. Irish, German, English, occasionally Italian. And even though there was actually a huge morphine and heroin problem in the 1800s, little was done to criminalize it. And it wasn't until the late 1880s when Lebanese, Syrian, and Jews, especially from that area, started immigrating to the United States that the United States started to create laws against this, against use of illicit substances. And they did somewhat, again, I can only comment on the correlation, so I can't comment on what was going on. But I would like to point out that in 1921, the Nation of Origins formula was passed by Congress, which started limiting immigration to the United States. That was actually the first formal limit of immigration to the United States. And around the same time, there was started to be a large immigration of Mexicans into the South and West. There was a huge explosion of construction and development of the Southwest. They needed labor. Mexico was right there. Mexico, the economy wasn't doing as well as the United States back then, and a lot of Mexicans were coming to the United States to work, and they brought with them marijuana. They liked to use marijuana recreationally, not alcohol, which most of the white European ancestors had liked. And therefore, the marijuana tax and marijuana law was passed, and I have it here somewhere. I'll talk about it a little bit. Actually, also, interestingly, I don't know if you guys find this interesting or not, but I do, so I'm going to say it, because it's my chat. Hemp was illegalized in large part because of the Mexican immigration, but there also happened to be, at that time, it was found out that you could process hemp to make paper. And the paper barons were very concerned that hemp would supplant their business, and so they very much pushed this marijuana legislation. So when the Mexican immigration wave started, marijuana became illegal. And it was one of the ways that they could use to control the population of the immigrants. Then as the trains were being built later on, the Chinese immigration started, especially out west, to build railroads and to build for the gold rush and things like that. And that actually mirrors the opium laws that were passed. The Chinese brought with them opium, because they like to smoke. And we could talk all about how that came about, but I won't. And so sorry, I lost my train of thought. So that's where the ban on opium came from, mirrors that as well. And it kind of keeps going as you keep going through time. As more African-American population was freed in the South, and certain things that they like to do, which is mostly tobacco and marijuana, was again more regulated by the United States, and moving on and on. And that, I don't know if that mirrors as well now, because kind of, for better or worse, the United States has made everything homogenous as far as drug use goes. There's not really like this ethnic group that likes to use drugs, though we think that there is. I bet you if I polled people here, and I gave an ethnic group, and you could give me the idea of the drug that's their drug of choice. And I'm here to tell you that this has been studied extensively, and it is not true. Okay? Just to pluck an example from thin air, crack cocaine is typically considered by a lot of people to be something that African Americans enjoy. That is not true. There is no evidence to say that African Americans use crack cocaine more or less than white people. I will tell you in my experience that I have treated more white people for crack cocaine abuse than African Americans because there's more white people. But per capita it's the same, it's consistent across all racial bounds. Actually, almost all drugs of abuse are consistent across racial bounds. There are some exceptions, they're very minor, and it typically has to do with, the Somali populations where khat started because it was brought over from that part of Africa, though it's pretty generalized now. But in general, these are very small outliers. And in general, the mass population uses drugs similarly. However, they're not treated that way. So, another good example of that would be, let's skip it, sorry. Okay, so, the law against drugs mirrors the immigration pretty consistently, though not entirely. And then the issue becomes, well, why, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it kind of piecemeal legislation, and what kind of kicked off this big war on drugs, that saying war on drugs. And the answer is essentially, for lack of a better term, Nixon. Sorry. I don't know if Nixon fans here or not, but he was the guy who started the modern, it's viewed as starting the modern war on drugs. And I have to say, when Dr. Prasad asked me to give this talk, I was just thinking about this. I was really just want to talk about the war on drugs, but you really can't talk about the war on drugs without talking about race and without talking about mass incarceration. That quote I gave at the beginning of this talk wasn't true in the 1900s. I mean, the United States didn't jail more people. It wasn't even true in World War II. It was mostly true after that. And so what happened was, eventually after the Chinese immigrants came in 1914, they passed the Harrison Narcotics Act. It was the first act that ever did anything to start kind of curtailing the illicit trade and use of drugs. So it's basically said, yeah, the snake oil salesmen can't use this stuff anymore. It has to be regulated. Then in 1919, they passed the 18th Amendment, which legalized alcohol, kind of our puritanic roots. That didn't work out well. In 1930, the Federal Bureau for Narcotics was established, and then in 1937, marijuana was legalized. So Nixon comes about in 1970 and does the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. And that's when he announced that drugs are the number one threat to our country. It was communist drugs. Remember that, it was actually, that's what his line was. And he established the Drug Enforcement Agency, which people might not realize was actually only established in 1973. It's not that old. And the FBI has been around since the 1800s. The DEA has only been around since 1973. Other drug laws were passed. The New York City passed, or New York State actually passed something called the Rockefeller drug laws, which still stand on the books. They're still the most stringent drug laws ever passed. And some of the harshest penalties in the United States. As a result, 94% of drug offenders in New York State prisons, that Black and Latinos currently comprise about 94% of drug offenders in New York State prisons, still to this day, from the Rockefeller drug laws. What's interesting about them too is that, not inconsequentially, I don't think they realized this, but they essentially made any sort of group recovery activity illegal. In New York State, to this day, it is still illegal for more than 2 drug addicts, known drug addicts, to collude together. So you can't have any sort of group therapy, theoretically, you can't have any sort of group therapy meeting, like an NA meeting or an AA meeting, without it technically being able to be raided by the police. And depending on who's the mayor of New York, occasionally it does, in New York City especially, it does occasionally get raided, depending on how they're feeling. Those laws still stand on the books. So, Nixon passed this law. And the question, I guess, asked was why. Not that drug use had exploded during Nixon's period of time. It's not that there were more overdoses. Certainly what we're going through now is orders of magnitude greater than anything that was happening under Nixon's presidency. And there were all those sorts of theories and conspiracy theories and things like that, but I don't know if you guys read, there was actually an article published not that long ago in Harper's. Did anyone read that article? So Nixon's former domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, I don't think I'm saying that right. Ehrlichman, thank you. He basically gave a quote to them, and I'm going to read it, what he said. He said, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war, I mean, it's a war on drugs, or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know what we were lying about, the drugs? Of course we did. That was his quote. So that was basically the start of the institutionalization of race and the war on drugs. It started together. So that's why it's impossible to talk about one and not the other. In 1982, George H.W. Bush established the presence of the FBI and the CIA in the war on drugs. Previously, they hadn't been involved. But there's all sorts of those interdictions. Do you guys remember? Probably don't remember those. A lot of you are too young. But we kind of fight these shadow wars in Colombia, Nicaragua, and things like that. This is under the auspices of the war on drugs and something called supply reduction. So in economics, there's two things that drive markets roughly: demand and supply. And the United States war on drugs became very focused on destroying the supply of drugs to the United States. And at the time, it was funded about 25 times the rate of demand reduction. And in addiction medicine, we talk about demand reduction as treatment, essentially. So if you get addicts, to stop using drugs, the demand for drugs goes down, right? If you get drug dealers to stop selling drugs, the supply of drugs goes down. Well, the United States has been hyper-focused on supply reduction in a lot of ways. And so billions of dollars were given to the CIA and foreign governments. And this is all actually out in the open now. Was given to fight these kind of wars against the drug suppliers in these countries. This was expanded upon in the Welfare Reform Act in 1996, passed by Bill Clinton, which imposed at the time a lifetime ban on welfare benefits for anybody who had a drug offense, a felony drug offense. Meaning they couldn't get food stamps, they couldn't get subsidized housing, they couldn't get job training if they had been convicted of a drug crime. Now this is not true if you had committed rape, by the way, or murder, but if you committed a drug crime, you could not get these benefits. At the same time, treatment, or funding and treatment, had dropped dramatically. And to this day, actually still, the reduction in funding is still about 10 times, spent about 10 times more on supply reduction than on demand reduction. I would like to say that people will say, well, how do you know supply reduction is more beneficial than demand reduction? The answer is I don't, but if you look at a similar market, the best I could come up with is sex trafficking. Okay, it's kind of, we all kind of agree it's not a great idea to buy and sell women or men, buy and sell sex. And there's a supply and demand of this. And in the United States, we kind of, again, go after the supply of it, right? We kind of try to lock up the prostitutes and the pimps, and we don't really punish the Johns at all. Well, there has been a country that's been very successful, which used to be a big hub, actually, of sex trafficking, and now it's virtually eliminated, and that's Sweden. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but Sweden has essentially tried exactly the opposite. They decided, well, the supply side stuff isn't working very well, let's just go after the Johns. So if the women or men come in and they're being trafficked and abused, we're not going to treat them as criminals, we're going to get them help. But if a John comes to try to buy sex, we're going to prosecute them. Okay? And actually it's been tremendously successful. So while it's not a great example of the war on drugs, it does give an idea that maybe a single supply-sided effect isn't ideal. So we have this huge imbalance. And to give you an idea, still in 2000, the government estimated that of about the 4.7 million regular users of drugs, only 16% of that group ever received any treatment. 16%. And over the past 8 years, treatment has only been about 20% of the total drug control budget. It's over the last, still over in Obama. And domestic law enforcement represents more than 50% of the budget for the war on drugs, still. So back to trying to put this together now, right? Race and the war on drugs. In the United States, again, 698 adults per 100,000 are incarcerated. It's a lot. The next country that incarcerates in the world is Russia, at 446 per 100,000. So we're 30% higher than that. The total number of drug arrests is actually hard data to understand, or to find, frankly. But what I can say is that the percentage of adult males that are incarcerated for drug crimes versus the total percent of the incarcerated population. So, of adult male, white adult men, there's a 0.7% of us that are locked up for drug crimes. And we make up about 39% of the total inmate population of the United States. Our Hispanic men, there's about a 1.8% chance if you're Hispanic that you're locked up for a drug crime, or you have been. And they make up 19% of the general population. African Americans, there is a 4.7% chance that you're locked up for a drug crime, and they make up 40% of the prison population of the United States. Overall, it's 1.4% of men, this is the data on men, that are locked up. So, it's done in this very subtle way so that we don't even realize what's happening. But, again, going back to the crack and the cocaine issue that we talked about earlier, as a physician, there's no difference between crack and well, between cocaine and rocked cocaine, which is crack. They're cocaine. It's just a different way of using it. Powdered cocaine you snort or inject. Crack you smoke or inject. That's really the only thing. There's physiologically no difference behind it. It makes no sense that there would be difference in penalties for it. However, there's a huge difference in penalties for it. It carries roughly 18 times the length of prison sentence for crack than it does for cocaine, for powdered cocaine. Again, as I said, whites use crack at the same rate that African Americans do. But African Americans are 40 times more likely to be prosecuted than whites for cocaine, for crack possession. When whites are charged, they are often charged under the powdered laws and not the crack laws. So because it's considered a African American drug, it has kind of this unfair advantage, unfair sentencing scheme to it. So I just want to show some more data on this. I have it here because I couldn't memorize it. But again, in the US population, whites make up about 65%. And people in federal prison for drug offenses, whites are about 20%. Latinos make up about 15% of the US population. And again, this is federal prison. They make up about 30% for drug offenses. This is for drug offenses. African Americans make up about 10% of the United States population and are roughly 40%. And I can't stress enough that the fact that there is no statistical difference in the amount of drugs used, type of drugs used, in any sort of racial lines. If anything, this is a board question on the addiction medicine boards, and people still don't believe it. But of all racial groups, there actually is a racial group that statistically is less likely to use drugs than all other racial groups, and that's African Americans. They actually have the lowest rates of addiction. And it's not a huge amount. The average population is about 9%. Native Americans is a little bit more, it's 10%. African Americans are 8%, but it's because the numbers are so big, it's actually statistically significant. Yet it is still treated as that they use predominance of the drugs in this country. 40% of all federal drug people locked up for drugs are African American. That defies the statistics of drug use. So there has to be something going on. The other thing that I do think fires the war on drugs and fires racial inequality. You can't talk about this, and I know this is a sensitive topic, without bringing up policing. The war on drugs is fundamentally controlled. It's controlled by the federal government and the laws that they regulate, but it's ultimately enforced by the police. And it can be enforced or not enforced how they see fit, essentially, and certain things are overlooked. Not a saint, I certainly have driven under the influence. I was once pulled over when I was under the influence. Not proud of it, but it happened to me. I did not get charged because I was probably a good-looking, not good-looking, I'm sorry. I was well-groomed, let's put it that way. I was well-groomed. I was a well-groomed white kid driving in suburbia in Madison. I guarantee you, my friend Greg been driving under the influence, it would have done more than that. And the guy was like, well, go home. The cop knew. I could tell the cop knew. It was late at night. I'd come from a party. I was an idiot, but what do you want? Now, why is... You would almost think that it would be almost in the police's best interest just not to enforce some of this low-level stuff. And a lot of those drug crimes, by the way, are low-level. They're almost all from possession. And I don't think I have those statistics here. I didn't print them. Which is okay, because I've given you guys a lot of stats. But the predominance of drug charges are not people that are distributing drugs. It's really not for sales or trafficking. It's for possession. Something like 70% of people that are locked up are for possession. And as an addiction medicine doctor, that really bothers me because fundamentally I view it as a medical problem, and I'm not a fan of locking people up for medical disease. It doesn't work very well, at least theoretically, and actually it doesn't work very well. So, what would be the police motive to start enforcing, especially on low-level drug offenders? So you have some marijuana. Even so you have some methamphetamine. If you're going to use it, why would the police go through all of this work to process you and arrest you? It's a lot of work for them. What's the motivation behind that? Well, they made it motivating to the police because of something called civil forfeiture. I don't know if you guys have seen the excellent piece that John Oliver did on the Nightly Show about civil forfeiture, but that's essentially laws that were passed. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to go and sell meth, though some police officers have been indicted for selling drugs that they've seized. There was actually a fairly large case in Long Island when I was there, in Nassau County, the Nassau County Drug Enforcement Agency. Their head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, when I was in med school, was thrown in jail for 30 years for trafficking methamphetamine, and he basically was just selling methamphetamine that he had seized. So it does happen, but they can keep the money and they can keep the cars and they can keep anything that's related to drugs. And it's incumbent upon you, the person they've seized it, to prove that it's not involved in drugs. It's the other way around and everything, right? You're innocent until proven guilty in everything except civil forfeiture. In which case, if you have money on you, and they say that money is related to drug trafficking, quick, and it's now their money, until you can prove to them it's not involved in drug trafficking, which I don't know how you do that. So it's a huge amount of money. In 2011, the last time that I could find data for it, $1.8 billion in assets have been seized in the United States through civil forfeiture. And if you can understand, especially in the South and West, this makes up a significant percentage of law enforcement budget. It's a significant source of funding that they get. So they're incredibly monetarily motivated to go after these people. So if they find a little bit of meth or a little bit of marijuana in your car, so use me as an example. If that officer had decided to kind of go after it because I was drinking, he could have seized my car, he could have seized whatever cash I had on me, he could have seized everything, theoretically, under the civil forfeiture law, and then I'd have to prove in a court of law that it wasn't involved in the practice in drug trafficking. Which, again, I don't think is really possible. I mean, you have to prove beyond a doubt. I don't see how that's possible, and often these cases are not proven, the ones that go to trial. So a large amount of this comes from, a large amount of law enforcement funding comes from this. In 2015, Obama did pass a law that made it more difficult for police to keep large sums of money. There's a cap on it now. And now it kind of goes to this escrow fund, and then it's like not the police's, but not yours, and you can kind of try, now they both have to go to court and prove which one's more likely. It's still a huge pain in the ass, and if you can imagine you're poor and relatively disadvantaged in the social hierarchy, you know, you're gonna hire a lawyer to go after your car? I mean, no, right? You basically don't have enough money to scrape by day to day. You're not gonna go to hire a lawyer to go to court to fight over your car. So it's still really kind of unfair, especially for poor populations. So there have been some changes. I'd also like to point out that recently, over the last 4 years, statistically, the number of African Americans being incarcerated for drug crimes is falling. The number of white people is rising. Now, that may be because we are being more enlightened as a society, but I suspect it's because more and more whites are using more illicit drugs, particularly heroin. So now we all kind of know about the opioid epidemic that's going on. It is, again, now a predominantly white problem, actually. Opioid overdoses are disproportionately more likely to happen to whites or Caucasians than to any other ethnic group. And suddenly, we're having all this talk about fixing the war on drugs and fixing the illegalization of this, and maybe we should have some demand reduction, and maybe we should have some more money for treatment and things like that. I don't think that this is a coincidence. I think that this still is ingrained somewhat to the United States in the way that we have viewed minorities in the war on drugs. But it's a step in the right direction, but it's not by any means over. So just to sum up, and I want to leave some time to discuss this because there's a lot of stuff that I talked about, and I had so much going through my mind. I just tried to put some stuff down that I thought to get things started that would be interesting to talk about. But again, the United States imprisons more people than any other country in the world. Predominance of our prison populations are for possession of illegal substances. The predominance are African American or Hispanics, despite the fact that there is absolutely no data to support that they would use more. There are all sorts of laws that make it more difficult for people that have drug crimes to get reassimilated into society, making it much more likely for them to reoffend. It's still very difficult to get a job. I don't know if anybody here is a provider or has any sort of dealings with people that have felony charges, but it's incredibly difficult to get a job if you have a felony. And the predominance of especially my patients now, that have felonies are for felony drug possession. still very hard to get a job, very hard to get benefits. There's large economic forces at play. There's the whole private prison system, which is still greatly subsidized by the war on drugs. Essentially, it exists because of the war on drugs. The jail system in general is sometimes the only industry that some of these towns have anymore, is the corrections industry. There's a lot of political gain. I'd be lying if I didn't say that coming out and supporting decriminalization or lessening of the war on drugs wouldn't come off as being soft on crime. Federal funding for border states, I mean, the Border Patrol gets a lot of their money through the war on drug fund. And the federal bureaus get a lot of money. The CIA and FBI still get a ton of money because of the war on drugs. The DEA is almost entirely funded under the line item in the budget for the war on drugs. And this is all compounded by the fact that there's a very clear stigma of drug addiction. I mean, still to this day, despite the fact that it has been known as a disease since the 1930s, and I'm talking about substance use, there's still this thought that people that use and abuse illicit substances are morally weak and inferior to those that don't. And because of that, it makes it very easy to pick on them, and regardless of the race. But especially if you already have the predilection of being biased racially or racist, and on top of that, have the disease of addiction, it makes it very easy to become subjugated to essentially unfair treatment by those in power because they just view you as less than. And I see this every day. And finally, I want to give a shout out to the movie The House I Live In. I don't know if anybody's seen that. It's by Eugene Jarecki. It's actually an excellent documentary about the war on drugs. And the three strikes law, which I didn't even talk about, which is responsible for a lot of the incarceration in California. California's actually done a lot on trying to reduce its prison population. They don't have room for people anymore. I remember when Lindsay Lohan got arrested for her 8th DWI, she spent like a day in prison and they released her because they had no room. Well, so that dude that had like an ounce of weed could stay in prison. Right? I mean, it's true. California, by far more than any other state, imprisons people for possession. It's actually it's statistically significant. Though they've done a better job that they decriminalize marijuana now. But he talks a lot about that. So I just want to thank everyone. I hope we get a conversation started. I have a lot of information still that I didn't go through because I didn't want to bore you guys by just droning on and on about statistics. But it's an important topic to talk about because this is a medical disease that kills people, and jailing them is not the solution to that. Just like jailing someone who doesn't control their diabetes will not help them magically control their diabetes, jailing someone for drug and alcohol dependence will not magically help them control their drug and alcohol disease. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you. Dr. Hubble.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. It's good. You want me to go? Okay. So you said you work with ASAM on their policy department division. What do you think is the most important policy work you're doing right now with them?
That's a great question. So the question is, what do I think is the most important policy work that ASAM is doing? So keep in mind that ASAM has no actual law writing capacity. They can just write statements that say, we feel this or we feel that. I don't, that's actually a great question. And I would say one of two things. The first is, I'm probably getting in trouble for saying this, so, the medicalization of marijuana. So I am in favor of, obviously I think, at this point, of decriminalizing most drugs of abuse. That being said, it doesn't mean that if you rob somebody at gunpoint because you need money for heroin, that you shouldn't face the consequences of assault and armed robbery. But I think throwing doctors in the middle of making something legal for medicinal purposes without evidence is a problem. So that's what ASAM is doing a lot of work on. And I guess the other thing is the international work around the drug problem. So this is not actually a problem unique to the United States. Certain other countries are actually having more of an opioid problem than even the United States. In particular, the country that actually has the biggest problem is Iran. Iran has lost more of its population to drug overdose than any other country per capita in the world. And they're really struggling. And they've done a lot of work. And so ASAM is trying to create an international policy around treatment and just very basic guidelines for countries that have absolutely no infrastructure. And while the war on drugs may be backwards and punitive, it is something. A lot of countries have nothing. They literally tell people, just stop using it, and if you don't, we'll kill you. And they don't, and so they kill them. In Russia, until the 90s, they used to lobotomize drug addicts. That worked very well. So that's what I think. Thank you. That's a good question. Dr. Critchlow.
Is anyone doing any work with the powder cocaine, crack cocaine?
So is anyone doing any work with the powder cocaine, crack cocaine issues? Yes. There are a lot of advocacy groups out there. I don't know of any that are focusing solely on that. Barack Obama has made some changes to that. It is less than it used to be, though it is still, I think, 10 times more now. It's better than 18, I suppose. Most of the work that I'm aware of is on trying to wind down the war on drugs, trying to start defunding some of this. And I think once that happens, you're probably going to see some change in that as well, but potentially not. So no, I'm not aware of anybody in particular doing that. That's a good question. Most of the energy is focused on the actual war on drugs.
What are your feelings about winding down the war on drugs? Is that something you would rather see it wound down and gone, or refocused, or do you think that's possible?
This is a good question. So what are my thoughts about winding down the war on drugs? Well, I actually go back and forth on this a little bit, because I do, while jailing people for possession of small amounts of drugs is not effective, compelling people to treatment via threat of legal action is very effective. There's actually very good evidence that it does not matter how you wind up in treatment. Whether you're coerced or come of your own volition, the outcomes are all the same. It's difficult for people to understand. It's part of the reason why you can commit people for chemical dependency, even though they swear up and down that they won't ever stop using. Once they get clean, they're actually, maybe I will stop using. So there's a role for the illegalization of certain substances. The other side of that too is, care to guess what the two drugs that cause the most problems in the United States by far? Alcohol and tobacco, right? They are legal. That's probably why they cause the most amount of problems. And then, prohibition didn't work, clearly, but it did reduce drinking. I mean, actually, from a medical perspective, it worked quite well. Alcohol-related deaths dropped during prohibition. Not a fan of going back to that either. I think there's got to be some sort of middle ground. I think in an ideal world, you would use it as a system to help people get treatment. So almost like a drug court system. So you're not going to be like, hey, you have a little bit of methamphetamine, why don't you spend the next 4 years of your life in prison? You're like, hey, you have a little bit of methamphetamine, why don't you go to treatment? Or if I catch you with some more methamphetamine, then you're going to have to be in this system where you have to go see a lawyer, and you have to go to court and do U-toxes and blah, 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 blah. And then if you fail that, then you might have to spend some time in jail. I think that's a very effective system for treatment. But just locking someone up for 4 years for methamphetamine use, I don't think is effective. So that's what I mean by wound down. I'd like to see it morph into more of a system where it promotes recovery and can be used as a tool. I think it's crazy that we lock up people longer for drug and alcohol use than we do for violent crime. I mean, I think it's something like 7% of the United States population, prison population is locked up for violent crime. It's like 7%. I think it's crazy. Anyway, Dr. Olson.
Great talk. So I'm a huge fan of the show Narcos on Netflix, looking at
I'm actually not familiar with that.
administration and Pablo Escobar and sort of the supply and demand thing that you're talking about. From what I've seen through a season and a half, the attacking the supply has not worked well. A lot of bloodshed, some problems. That's good for TV watching, but bad for policy. So when you talk about the supply and demand side of things, I mean, I think it's hard because you attack the supply and the next supplier just pops up, and there's a lot of corruption within foreign governments too. What do you see, the demand side can be difficult as far as just our own policy here in the United States. Police have a tough job in trying to figure out those things sometimes. Are there any key things that you see on attacking the demand side here in our own country that might be more effective, or things we should be putting more time into?
That's a great question. To sum it up for people that may not have heard, is attacking the demand, the supply side hasn't worked. What do I see that could potentially work on the demand side to help? Some help the awfulness that has attacked them, that has been caused on the supply side, so to speak. So to answer that question very shortly, I would say the drug court system has been actually quite effective. There's some very good data on this. So in Hawaii, which is actually a state that has been ravaged by methamphetamine use, established the largest drug court system in the country. Typically, someone who's methamphetamine dependent that goes through treatment, in a year, about 90% of them have relapsed. In their drug court system they're currently using, about 60% of them are still sober after a year. So if you take people that are using methamphetamine and you diminish the supply by half, essentially, you can get half the people sober, that's going to have a dramatic effect on the market for methamphetamine. And Hawaii has already seen that. I mean, Hawaii is not an easy place to smuggle drugs into, to begin with. And so the price of methamphetamine has gone way up, and there's actually less methamphetamine users. So I think the drug court system is a very effective way of reducing demand. And yes, it does involve criminal activity. I mean, that's the way that you get into that. But the vast majority of these people are not incarcerated. They're given help to get their life around and given work skills and jobs, and now are members of society that are actually productive. And like any chronic disease, they are monitored for sometimes, depending on their crimes, prolonged periods of time. And if they have a relapse, they're not thrown into jail, but they're given more treatment. So that, I think, is probably the best thing that can be done for the demand side reduction, in a large scale. I mean, there are other things you could do. You could fund mental health better. You could fund education for primary care doctors on addiction better. You could do a variety of things. But I think that would be the best. Mike?
So on that note, cost comparison between incarcerated individuals and getting them comprehensive care, how do they compare?
I don't have that data off the top of my head. I mean, I can pull some stuff roughly. I mean, so the issue, I see you, Shelley. Let me finish this now. I know it's related to that. Don't worry, trust me. So the reason why that becomes difficult is, are you talking about one treatment? Are you talking about one like 30 days of inpatient treatment and outpatient treatment, and then that's it, versus 40 years of incarceration? Well then, yeah, it's a lot cheaper than 40 years of incarceration. Are you talking about 30 days of treatment versus 30 days of jail? Well then, jail is cheaper. So part of that is statistically, it's just hard to tease that apart. But in general, incarceration is much more expensive than treatment. Charlie?
I just want to add to what Mike mentioned. The Portugal example suggests that the mental health treatment aspect of it is much better cost-wise than the incarceration.
I mean, just looking at a cost-benefit analysis, I mean, how much benefit are we getting for locking up people that use drugs versus the cost, right? That is tremendously expensive. To lock up 70% or 90% of the population for possession and use of a drug is extremely expensive. This is very, very expensive. There's no question about that. It's like 30% of California's budget is spent on incarcerating their population. So clearly it would be cheaper to provide treatment, which is part of the reason why California has made such changes in their treatment, as you well know. But California is actually one of the best states to now seek treatment in, because they've tried to do that. So I'm dancing around the question a little bit, but the bottom line is probably cheaper to offer treatment. But if someone, I've seen patients that have been through treatment 10, 12, 14 times, that's expensive. At some point, it may actually just be cheaper. Though I still think that's morally and ethically wrong, but cost-wise, it may be cheaper. Okay.
So in digging through as much data and statistics as you could find, was there anything that you were looking for that you couldn't find? Anything from the public health research or the statistics that seemed like a glaring hole to you that maybe you felt like this is what we should be looking into?
So the question is there anything I didn't find in the statistics that's glaring hole, something to look into? That's a great question. This is going to be heavily biased on my interests, because that's what just sticks in my mind. It would be really great to take a look at how many people meet the criteria for substance use disorder and how severe it is, and correlate it with their outcomes through the prison population. We all know that people have a very high recidivism, but I would guess that the more severe your disease is, the more likely prison is going to be just very bad for you. It's a place where your disease is just going to get worse, and you're just going to keep cycling through. First, potentially if you have a milder form of the disease, potentially, I guess, the prison could almost be treatment. I thought that was interesting. There's nothing on that because no one does medical intake on that in prison population. Is that right?
It's sort of a comment rather than a question. Just I'd be interested in your feelings about the interface or overlap between mental health disorders and addiction. It seems to me that you frequently find mental health diagnoses with patients whose symptoms are obviously due to their drug use, and I'm sure some reverse must. Whatever. I'd be just interested in your thoughts on the interface.
So the question is, what is the interface between mental health disorders and substance use disorders? How much time do you get? Short-ish answer is I can see people heading for the exit zone. The short answer is it's difficult to know. The American Psychiatric Association says that you must be free of all substances for 1 year before any sort of mental health disorder can be diagnosed. The American Society of Addiction Medicine doesn't take that view because it's virtually impossible. Then, like, no one would have depression, right? No one with substance use disorder would have depression. And they said, it's hard. So for when I was working at Hazelden, I cannot tell you the percentage, but it's very high of the people that came in that carried either generalized anxiety disorder, depression, or bipolar, or all three, or two of the three. That upon discharge between 30 and 90 days later were on nothing for mental health disorders because it was probably entirely related to substances. That being said, though, it's well documented that once you get sober, you get kind of an almost rebound euphoria. It's called the pink cloud, for those of you curious. And so when you're newly sober, you're going to get this, your pleasure centers are all very depleted, and then they kind of come back and they realize that the natural world can actually supply some pleasure, and there's a huge rush of pleasure related to that. And so that can actually make depression and anxiety disappear. Then it can come back. It's complicated. The truth is, though, the best guess is that it's probably a little bit higher in patients with substance use disorder, but not strikingly, not as much as the data would suggest that it is. But yeah, I've seen numerous charts all over that carry depression, anxiety, polysubstance use. Well, is it the chicken or the egg? I don't know.
I came from an area of Oregon that was one of the hotbeds of meth production and also bipolar disorder.
Nothing can mimic bipolar disorder better than methamphetamine use. Oh, you have a lot of energy. Oh, you have no energy. Oh, you have a lot of energy. Yes, sure. Hey.
I haven't kept up with Colorado and Oregon a lot, but what are your thoughts about legalization? And we talked about medicalization, but legalization and how to play out in the
It's a great question. So the legalization of marijuana, the recreational use of marijuana in Washington, Colorado, how's it played out? The jury in general is out on that. It's pretty clear in general that marijuana certainly is at least not as bad as alcohol, if not better. Does that make sense? I said that in a really weird way. And it's worse, the data would suggest that marijuana is as bad as alcohol for the human body. That's bad in a unique way than alcohol, but it's not great. It would be ideal if you didn't use it every day for your general health. But there are a lot of things that would be ideal. It would be ideal if I didn't eat a hamburger every day, but I go through periods where I do. And that's not good for me. But ultimately in this country, we're free to make that choice. If you talk about addictiveness of a drug, marijuana is not as addictive as some of the other drugs, especially tobacco, which is a legal drug. There are problems that Colorado is having. In particular, the biggest issue that they're having right now, it's a huge issue, I was just actually out there 2 weeks ago, is driving while under the influence of marijuana. And because it's difficult to pick up, it's difficult to know if it's acute ingestion or not, and the tests we have aren't very accurate. There isn't a very good test for that. So that's an issue that they're having. I think it remains to be seen. I mean, I could go through this extensively, and I don't want to bore people with the data on it, but there is some data to suggest that heavy, regular use of marijuana causes decrease in IQ, and it can cause decrease in motivation and drive. Basically, nothing kind of becomes pleasurable, so why go try to get promoted at work? It doesn't seem like it's that important. That kind of insidious decline in the human spirit, shall we say. Does that mean it should be legal? I don't think so. I think it should be regulated. makes sense. I feel like I dodged that. Dr. Wu.
So I'm pretty sure I have not heard either of our presidential candidates discuss the war on drugs, at least during the debate. Are you aware of anyone who might be in a position that can change the laws that are so onerous against certain populations that is supporting, that we can then get behind? Because I have not heard anyone say it.
That's a great question. So is there anybody out there that's actually looking at this and trying to do something about it? The answer is yes, actually. So Obama's new drug czar, Botticelli, I'm spacing out his first name. I've actually met him twice. I mean, in passing, it's not like I'm buddies with him. But he's openly in recovery himself. He talks about his alcohol and cocaine use and his subsequent recovery. And he talks about how important it is to get people into recovery. And he talks openly about trying to end the